What if I told you that in a matter of days the FIA has caused a turn so brutal that it could decide the championship, suddenly taking away a key advantage from Mercedes and handing it on a plate to Ferrari? Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. Because this is not a simple rule, it is a direct blow to the heart of performance. Mercedes was exploiting a legal loophole that gave them extra power right at the most important moment of the entire lap. An invisible advantage, impossible to detect with the naked eye, but devastating on the stopwatch. And when everything seemed under control, Ferrari makes its move, the FIA intervenes, and boom, banned overnight. Now the question is inevitable. Are we looking at a decision for safety or a move that completely changes the balance of power in Formula One? The problem didn't start as a scandal. It started as an invisible advantage that very few understood, but that was already making a difference on the grid. While most teams were still focused on optimizing their traditional setups, Mercedes and Red Bull had gone a step further, finding a loophole in the regulations that was not only legal, but extremely powerful. We are not talking about a controversial aerodynamic piece or a concept visible on the track. We are talking about something much more sophisticated, the exact management of energy at the most critical moment of the entire lap, the classification. The 2026 regulation clearly established that the MG UK had to progressively reduce its power when the battery reached its limit, a mandatory ramp down that everyone assumed was an inevitable restriction. But that's where the genius or controversy of this story comes in. There was an exception, a small clause designed to protect the engine in the event of imminent failure, which allowed the electrical system to be completely turned off. What these teams did was reinterpret that exception in a way that no one had exploited before, maintain all the power available during the final stretch, and just after crossing the finish line, activate that emergency shutdown. The result was perfect, too many perfect. Suddenly, where others lost power, they continued pushing to the maximum. Where others followed the rule to the letter, they found a way around it without breaking it. And in a sport where thousands mean everything, that difference was beginning to be decisive. It was not obvious to the viewer, but within the paddock questions were already beginning to be asked. Why were certain cars clearly faster right at the end of straights? How could they maintain that level of thrust when the rest were already limited? That's where Ferrari comes in, and this is where the story takes its first major turn. Because Ferrari not only detects what is happening, but understands the true risk of trying to copy it. Implementing that system was not immediate. It required time, development, and assuming a dangerous margin of error. Instead of following that path, they decided to play a completely different card, take the debate to the field where they could really win, the FIA. But they did not do so by attacking the direct legality of the system. That was the smart move. Ferrari focused the focus on something much more delicate and difficult to ignore, the consequences. Because this trick was not only an advantage in qualifying, it was pushing the cars to extreme situations with energy, creating scenarios where a car could run out of power in compromised areas of the circuit. And that risk, at first theoretical, began to become real. What until then was a brilliant engineering move was beginning to show its most dangerous side. Equipment at the limit, systems forced to the maximum, and an increasingly fine line between performance and critical failure. Ferrari saw it before anyone else and decided not to compete in that field, but to completely change the rules of the game. The breaking point wasn't a meeting, it wasn't a statement, it was the clue. Because all this game at the limit that Mercedes and Red Bull were executing with millimeter precision began to show its most dangerous side when real conditions could no longer hide the consequences. Until then, the MG UK trick was perfect in theory. You extracted maximum performance right where it mattered and paid the price when it no longer affected your lap time. But Formula One is not played in theory. It is played at the absolute limit, where any small mismatch becomes a huge problem. And that's exactly what started happening. Energy systems began to work in critical areas, bringing cars to a situation where management was no longer simply aggressive, it was unsustainable. The key moment came when several cars began to run out of energy in delicate areas of the circuit. We are not talking about losing a few tenths, we are talking about cars without power in high-speed sectors completely exposed. A situation that, within modern Formula One, is simply unacceptable. That was the moment in which everything changed because what Ferrari had raised as a concern began to materialize in front of everyone. Ferrari had already made its move, and now it had the perfect evidence. The pressure on the FIA became immediate. It was no longer a technical discussion between teams, it was a visible, tangible security problem, impossible to ignore. And when the FIA enters that field, there is no room for negotiation. The priority is no longer innovation or interpretation of the regulations. It becomes absolute risk control. The decision was as quick as it was forceful, immediate ban. And this is where everything explodes. Because for Mercedes, this was not just losing an advantage, it was losing a complete development investment, a tool that they had perfected, and that was part of their qualifying performance. The feeling within the team is clear. They had found a solution within the rules. They had executed it better than anyone else, and yet it was suddenly taken away from them. The frustration is total, because from their perspective, an illegality is not punished. A technical superiority is punished. Meanwhile, Ferrari observes the chaos from a completely opposite position. Not only did it avoid the risk of implementing a system on the edge, but now sees its main rivals lose a key advantage just when it matters most. It is a perfect strategic coup because they have not had to adapt, they have forced the others to retreat. And in the midst of all this, the paddock begins to divide. Some teams see the decision as necessary, as a logical intervention in the face of an obvious risk. Others interpret it as a dangerous line, where innovation can be slowed down even when it remains within the regulations. But what no one can deny is the immediate impact. The competitive balance has just changed. Because this is no longer just about a prohibited system, it's about who loses the most with this decision. And now we come to the real consequence, the impact that goes far beyond a simple ban. Because when the FIA makes a decision of this caliber, it doesn't just eliminate an advantage, it completely redefines the game board. The first big reality is immediate. Mercedes loses one of its most refined weapons in qualifying. It's not something that they can recover in a week or with a simple adjustment. It was a system integrated into his way of extracting performance, into his philosophy of how to attack the fastest lap. Without that extra power in the final moments, the car is no longer the same. And that, in sport where everything is optimized to the millimeter, translates directly into lost positions. And in Formula One, losing positions on Saturday means starting Sunday with a structural disadvantage. But most important thing is not only what Mercedes loses, it is what Ferrari gains without having changed anything at all in its car. Ferrari now enters a scenario where the differences in classification are compressed, where that artificial advantage disappears and everything depends again on what you really have: chassis, aerodynamics, execution, and driver. And in that area, Ferrari had already shown that it was much closer than it seemed. In fact, in several recent sessions, it was already clear that they could fight at the top when the conditions were equal, but they were not. Now, yes, this opens up a completely new scenario. Because suddenly, the fight is no longer conditioned by an invisible trick, but by pure performance. And that is where Ferrari can deliver the final blow. Not because they have made a huge technical leap, but because they have eliminated the leap of others. It is a key difference. You don't need to be faster if you can make the rest stop being faster. Meanwhile, the domino effect is beginning to be felt throughout the grid. Red Bull is also affected, losing a tool that complemented its performance on the straight, which adds even more pressure to a car that was already showing certain inconsistencies. And other teams, which had not managed to replicate this system, now find themselves on equal terms without having to invest resources in achieving it. But there is something even deeper in all of this, something that goes beyond immediate performance. The FIA has sent a clear message: not everything that is legal will survive if it crosses the risk line. And that changes the development mentality. From now on, each team will have to ask themselves not only can we do it, but are they going to let us do it? That shift in focus can slow aggressive innovations or completely redefine how advantages are sought. And in the midst of this new scenario, Ferrari is in a privileged position. Not only because of what he wins on the court, but because of how he has played off it. He detected, analyzed, and attacked at the perfect moment. He wasn't the fastest, he was the smartest. This is the real brutal twist. It's not just that Mercedes is furious, it's that Ferrari has managed to change the rules without touching their car. And in Formula One, when you achieve that, you are usually much closer to winning than you think. And in the end, it all boils down to one reality. This was not just a ban, it was a pure power shift within the FIA. Because what seemed like a simple, intelligent interpretation of the regulations by Mercedes and Red Bull ended up becoming the trigger for an intervention that has redefined the competitive balance. A brilliant system, yes, but taken so far to the limit that it ended up causing its own downfall. Mercedes goes from having a key advantage in qualifying to having to reinvent itself against the clock. From dominating a critical area to losing it completely overnight. And in such a tight championship, that type of blow is not measured in sensations. It is measured in positions, in points, and possibly in a title that can escape. And while some lose, others simply wait and win. Ferrari did not need to copy. It did not need to risk. It did not need to enter that game. He read the situation better than anyone, understood where the real weak point was, and attacked at the exact moment. Not on the track, but in the office. And in modern Formula One, that is often worth more than a tenth. This is the brutal twist everyone is talking about. Because it's not just about a forbidden trick, it's about how one decision can completely change who has the advantage before the race even starts. Now, the big question is not what happened. The real question is, who is going to know how to adapt faster to this new scenario, and who is going to be left behind at the most decisive moment of the season? Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now, you really think about all this.